He'd lost his reputation, his calling, and the woman who swore she believed in his quest. Then he won 2 newborns with nothing but a bluff and a heart full of doubt. What he didn't know was that fate wasn't finished testing him yet. Before we dive deeper into this twisted story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and enjoy. The saloon reeked of stale whiskey and unwashed prospectors, but nobody minded tonight. The poker table in the back corner sat under a hanging lantern that cast shadows like dancing spirits across weathered faces. Men leaned forward through the tobacco smoke, breathing shallow, spurs clicking beneath the table like rattlesnake warnings. Tonight wasn't about silver strikes or cattle deals. Tonight was about something that couldn't be measured in dollars. Hank, Bigfoot Hunter, Morrison had folded 5 hands running. He slouched in his chair now, worn leather hat pulled low to hide the exhaustion in his gray eyes, his massive hands resting flat on the scarred oak table. His chip stack had shrunk to nearly nothing. One boot was decent leather, the other held together with rawhide strips and prayer. A crumpled telegram from San Francisco was folded in his vest pocket, the words still burning like brands: expedition canceled. Funding withdrawn. Services no longer required. The truth cut deeper than any official dismissal. He'd spent 7 years tracking the creature through the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades, the remote peaks of Colorado territory. 7 years collecting footprints, hair samples, witness accounts that nobody wanted to believe. The scientific community had labeled him a fraud. The newspapers had turned him into a joke. Even the Pinkerton Detective Agency, who'd hired him originally to investigate unusual incidents in mining camps, had quietly severed their contract. Across from him sat, dead-eye, Tommy Santos, teeth stained brown from chewing tobacco, eyes like chips of flint. He was drunk enough to be careless, but not enough to lose the meanness that lived behind his grin. "One final hand," he wheezed, slapping a fresh deck onto the table with unnecessary force. "Winner claims everything." Everything turned out to be 2 newborn babies wrapped in a moth-eaten army blanket, lying in a makeshift crib fashioned from an old ammunition box beside the saloon's battered piano. They belonged to Santos, though the circumstances were murky as mountain fog. Word around town suggested he'd acquired them from a desperate widow up near Virginia City, trading debt forgiveness for children she couldn't feed. No documentation, no questions, just showed up with them like they were mining equipment he'd won in another game. Hank stared at the improvised crib, his stomach knotting. One of the infants stirred, releasing a weak, plaintive cry that somehow cut through the saloon's noise like a blade through silk. Something shifted inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid since the day the San Francisco Chronicle had published that editorial calling him the West's greatest fool, alongside a caricature of him chasing shadows through the forest. The rest of the table chuckled like they were watching a carnival act, but Hank's hand moved without conscious thought. He pushed forward what remained of his worldly possessions: his father's compass, his discharge papers from the Army Corps of Engineers, the custom-made rifle he'd carried through 7 years of fruitless searching, and the leather journal containing every piece of evidence he'd ever collected about the creature. "That's my stake," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "But it's worth more than it looks." Santos squinted at the pile, calculating. He knew about Hank's reputation, had heard stories about the obsessed tracker who'd given up everything to chase legends through the wilderness. "Deal," he said finally, curiosity overcoming caution. Cards hit the table like falling axes. Hank barely registered what he'd been dealt. 5 cards, meaningless as yesterday's newspaper. Whatever happened, he'd already made his choice. He wasn't leaving this saloon without those children. Not tonight. Not ever. The final hands revealed themselves. Santos cursed with impressive creativity and startling volume. Hank didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply stood and walked directly to the ammunition box, his boots loud against the warped floorboards. The saloon had fallen silent except for the soft rustle of blankets as one baby sighed in sleep. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered behind him. "He's actually gonna take them." Hank didn't respond. He bent down and lifted the box carefully, shocked by its lightness, not because it weighed little, but because these tiny lives seemed impossibly fragile for something that had just become his entire world. 2 small faces, one with dark hair like storm clouds, the other fair as corn silk, both bearing that newborn redness that spoke of recent struggle and older pain. He turned without explanation, pushing through the crowd of miners and drifters and professional gamblers, stepping out into the bitter Colorado night like a man walking toward either salvation or damnation, uncertain which. The mountain air hit him like a physical blow, sharp with altitude and snow that threatened from the black sky above. Stars scattered overhead like scattered coins, and his horse Thunder waited by the hitching post, ears pricked forward at Hank's approach with his strange, quiet burden. He had no plan beyond surviving the night. His cabin squatted in a clearing 10 miles up the mountain, built from pine logs he'd cut himself during his first winter in the territory. It contained a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and shelves lined with the journals and evidence that had consumed his adult life. But now he had 2 babies, and somewhere in that impossibility, something began to shift inside him. Not hope exactly, but a kind of desperate purpose. The ride through the darkness took 4 hours, the box balanced carefully against his chest while Thunder picked his way along trails barely wide enough for a horse and rider. The babies whimpered occasionally but rarely cried, too weak perhaps, or too accustomed to uncertainty. The smaller one, dark-haired like his father might have been, had fingers like tiny twigs that clutched at nothing. The fair-haired child had a birthmark on her forehead shaped like a star and a grip strong enough to hold onto hope. He named them on his cabin's porch, sitting with the box balanced between his knees, hands shaking as he cleaned their faces with water from his drinking cup. The dark-haired boy, who'd made barely a sound during the long ride, he called Daniel, after the prophet who'd survived the lion's den through faith alone. The girl, with her fierce grip and star-shaped mark, he called Stella. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than ever. Just his narrow bed, a work table covered with maps and sketches, a chair that had seen better decades, and the iron stove that hadn't been properly heated in weeks. Hank built a fire with desperate efficiency, feeding kindling and logs until heat began to chase the cold from the single room. He had no cradle, no baby supplies at all. So he took his spare blankets and built a nest in the corner near the stove, soft and warm, then placed each child down with the care of a man handling dynamite. They slept. Hank sat on the floor beside them, back against the log wall, and simply watched. He didn't sleep that night, or the next. The ammunition box sat empty in the opposite corner, but somehow it still felt heavy with significance. He kept it there like a monument to the moment his life had changed direction. News traveled faster than wildfire in mining country. Within days, everyone from the territorial capital to the smallest prospecting camp knew that Hank, Bigfoot Hunter, Morrison had won 2 babies in a poker game. Nobody questioned the specifics too closely, not out loud. But they looked at him differently now when he rode into town for supplies. Some with suspicion, others with something that might have been newfound respect. The general store owner started setting aside condensed milk without being asked. Doc Henley rode up from Leadville on his weekly rounds, examined both children with gentle thoroughness, and left behind medicine bottles with detailed instructions written in his careful physician's script. Even Father Murphy, the circuit priest, made the steep climb to Hank's cabin. Sometimes, the priest observed, watching Daniel grab Hank's calloused finger with surprising strength, divine providence works through the most unlikely circumstances. That doesn't make the blessing any less genuine. Hank had never been much for religion, but he nodded anyway. These days, he was willing to consider possibilities he'd previously dismissed. The priest's eyes moved to the corner where both babies now slept, cheeks flushed with health, breathing deep and regular. His weathered face creased with genuine warmth. "They're remarkable children. They're breathing," Hank said quietly. "Right now, that's miracle enough." But not everyone in the territory was prepared to accept this new arrangement. 4 days after Father Murphy's visit, a woman arrived on horseback with a territorial marshal riding escort. She dismounted stiffly, her traveling dress wrinkled from the long ride, hands trembling as she approached the cabin where Hank sat on the porch, both babies in his arms. When she saw the blanket-wrapped bundles, she collapsed to her knees in the dirt, sobbing with relief and anguish mixed together. "Those are my daughter's children," she gasped, pointing at Stella with a shaking finger. "Rebecca was taken by bandits 8 months ago. We thought, dear God, we thought they were all dead." Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, and her story emerged in fragments between tears. Her daughter had been captured during a raid on their ranch near Pueblo. The girl had survived long enough to give birth to twins, but died from fevers soon afterward. The babies had been sold from one outlaw to another until Santos acquired them as payment for gambling debts. Hank listened without interrupting, holding both children protectively. Finally, he asked, "Where's your home?" "Kansas City. 3 days by railroad." He nodded slowly. "You married?" "Widowed. But I have means. A house, investments. I can provide for them properly." Hank raised his hand, not harshly, just firmly enough to stop the rush of words. "You have experience with infants?" She hesitated. "Not recent experience, but know how to mix formula? Change diapers? Walk a colicky baby at 3 in the morning?" Her mouth opened, then closed. Hank looked at the marshal, a middle-aged man who sat his horse uncomfortably, clearly wishing he was anywhere else. "We're not here to force anything, Mr. Morrison," the marshal said carefully. "But if those children were taken from their lawful family—" "They were wagered," Hank said flatly, "and I won them legal." The silence that followed was thick as pine smoke. Wind sighed through the evergreens like it carried judgment in its breath. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice breaking. "Please, I'm not asking for both. Just Stella. She has her mother's eyes. I need something of my daughter still alive in this world." Hank looked down at Stella, then at Daniel. His chest constricted like a rope tightening around his ribs. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, walked to the makeshift bed in the corner, and knelt beside it for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised everyone, including himself. "You want her?" he asked gently. "Then you stay 2 weeks. You feed her. You change her. You walk her when she won't settle. You earn her trust. Not mine, hers." Eleanor stared, then slowly nodded, tears cutting tracks through the trail dust on her cheeks. The marshal touched his hat brim respectfully. "I'll be back in 2 weeks to see how things stand." After they'd gone, Hank sat alone with the children, studying their sleeping faces in the firelight. He'd spent 7 years tracking something that might not exist. Now he had 2 small lives that definitely did, and the responsibility felt heavier than any pack he'd ever carried through the mountains. Eleanor Whitfield proved tougher than her refined appearance suggested. She asked no favors, complained about nothing, simply did whatever needed doing. Not because she accepted Hank's terms necessarily, but because she sensed an iron determination in the big man that made arguments seem pointless. Hank had given up his bed, sleeping instead on blankets by the fire. Eleanor took to the infant care with desperate intensity, feeding Stella from bottles made with condensed milk, singing lullabies in a voice made rough by years of grief. She changed diapers with increasing efficiency, learned to swaddle properly, discovered which sounds soothed and which created more distress. Daniel proved more challenging. He fussed when Eleanor tried to hold him, turning away from her unfamiliar touch, settling only when Hank's deep voice rumbled through his barrel chest or when those enormous, gentle hands supported him with absolute steadiness. Eleanor noticed but didn't comment, just smiled sadly and focused her efforts on Stella, whose appetite was steadily improving. By the 4th day, Eleanor's rigid posture had begun to soften. Her voice grew more natural with the children, her movements less frantic. She asked Hank where he stored supplies, offered to wash baby clothes in the creek, even suggested improvements to their feeding schedule based on careful observation of the children's patterns. She also asked about his unusual profession. 7 years tracking Bigfoot, she mused one evening while Stella dozed in her arms. That must have been challenging. Hank was whittling a wooden spoon for mixing formula, wood shavings curling away from his knife in perfect spirals. Challenging's one word for it. What word would you use? He considered this, testing the spoon's smoothness with his thumb. Humbling. You spend years certain you're right, following evidence that seems clear as mountain streams, only to discover that certainty and truth aren't always the same thing. Do you still believe? In the creature, I mean? Hank looked at the sleeping children, then back at his whittling. I believe in what I can see and touch and protect. Everything else is just stories now. On the sixth night, while rain drummed the cabin roof and turned the world soft and gray, Eleanor asked the question that had been haunting her since she'd arrived. "Why didn't you just refuse?" she said quietly. "When I asked for Stella, you had legal right to say no." Hank didn't look up from the fire he was tending. Didn't feel like refusing was an option, he said simply. But it was. Hank shrugged his massive shoulders. "Maybe, maybe not. I looked at you and saw a woman who'd lost everything except hope. Figured I could spare some time to find out if that hope was worth anything. And now..." He finally looked at her, his gray eyes steady in the firelight. "Now I think hope's about the most valuable thing anyone can have in this territory." The seventh day brought unexpected visitors. Eleanor was outside hanging diapers on a line Hank had strung between two pine trees when they heard hoofbeats approaching from the south. Not the marshal returning early, but multiple riders moving with purpose. Hank stepped onto the porch, rifle in his hands, both babies secured in the cabin behind him. Eleanor moved closer to the door, her traveling dress replaced now by a practical calico dress she'd sewn from fabric Hank had bought in town. 5 men rode into the clearing, led by a thin, sharp-faced individual in a black suit who looked distinctly out of place in the wilderness. Behind him rode 4 men with the hard look of professional hired guns. "Mr. Morrison," the thin man called, dismounting with obvious discomfort. "My name is Jeremiah Blackwood, attorney at law. I represent the Territorial Children's Protective Society." Hank kept the rifle ready but not directly threatening. "Don't recall asking for a lawyer. We've received reports of irregular circumstances involving 2 minor children in your custody." Eleanor stepped forward, chin raised. "I'm Eleanor Whitfield. One of those children is my granddaughter." Blackwood consulted a leather portfolio. "Mrs. Whitfield, according to our investigation, you have no legal standing in this matter. These children were acquired through gambling, which violates territorial statutes regarding child welfare." "They were acquired through legal gaming," Hank corrected. "I have witnesses." "Witnesses to an illegal transaction," Blackwood sniffed. "The Territorial Children's Protective Society has authority to remove children from unsuitable environments and place them in appropriate institutions." The 4 hired guns spread out slightly, not drawing weapons but making their presence felt. Hank noticed their positioning: professional, practiced, dangerous. "What kind of institutions?" Eleanor demanded. "The Territorial Orphanage in Denver. Or perhaps placement with qualified families back east, where they can receive proper education and moral instruction." Hank's grip tightened on the rifle. "These children are healthy, fed and cared for. What more do they need?" "Structure, discipline, association with civilized society." Blackwood's voice carried the dismissive tone of a man accustomed to having his authority go unquestioned. "They require placement with appropriate families who can provide proper Christian guidance." "They have a family. You have no legal standing, Mr. Morrison. Your reputation as an eccentric tracker of mythical creatures hardly qualifies you as a suitable guardian. And Mrs. Whitfield's claim, while emotionally understandable, carries no legal weight." Eleanor's face flushed with anger. "My granddaughter stays with people who love her." "Love is insufficient," Blackwood replied coldly. "The law requires more substantive qualifications." Hank stood slowly, his considerable height making him loom over the thin attorney. "The law also requires warrants, proper procedures, territorial court approval. You bring me papers signed by a judge and we'll discuss this. Until then, you're trespassing." Blackwood's confident demeanor wavered slightly. "We can obtain proper documentation." "Then go obtain it." Hank's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that had once commanded engineering crews building railroad bridges across impossible gorges. "But know this, anyone who tries to take these children will face whatever resistance is necessary." The attorney remounted his horse with considerably less confidence than he'd shown upon arrival. "This matter is far from concluded, Mr. Morrison." "No," Hank replied, watching the group ride away. "It's just getting interesting." Eleanor stood beside him as the riders disappeared into the forest, dust settling in their wake. They'll be back with proper papers. Probably, Hank agreed. But that gives us time to prepare our own legal defense. What kind of defense? Hank looked at the cabin where both children slept peacefully, unaware that their future hung in the balance. The kind that proves love counts for more than law when it comes to protecting family. The next morning brought an unexpected ally. Doc Henley rode up the mountain trail leading a pack mule loaded with supplies, not just medical equipment, but food, clothing, and other necessities for caring for infants. "Heard about your trouble," he said without preamble, tying his horses to the hitching post Hank had built. "Figured you might need support." "Legal support?" Eleanor asked hopefully. "Better. Medical support. I'm prepared to testify that both children are receiving excellent care, that they're healthy and thriving under current arrangements." He paused to examine both babies, checking their weight, responsiveness, general condition. Any judge who orders these children removed after seeing my documentation would be making a serious error. Eleanor felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "You do that?" "I've been practicing medicine in this territory for 15 years, Doc Henley said firmly. "I know good parenting when I see it, regardless of how unconventional the circumstances." Hank nodded gratefully. "What else do we need?" "Character witnesses. Financial stability documentation. Proof that you can provide proper education and moral instruction." The doctor's eyes twinkled slightly. "And maybe a wife wouldn't hurt your case." Both Hank and Eleanor stared at him. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a distant campfire. "I'm not suggesting anything improper," Doc Henley added quickly. "But territorial law favors married couples for child custody matters. A marriage of convenience might strengthen your legal position considerably." Eleanor's cheeks colored, but her voice stayed steady. That's quite a suggestion, Doctor." "Desperate times," he replied simply. "I've seen good families destroyed by legal technicalities. Sometimes you have to work within the system's expectations." That evening, while the babies slept and rain drummed against the cabin roof, Hank and Eleanor sat by the fire discussing possibilities that would have seemed impossible 2 weeks earlier. "It would be a legal arrangement only," Eleanor said carefully, "for the children's protection." "Understood," Hank agreed. "Though we'd need to make it convincing." "How convincing?" He looked at her across the firelight, this refined woman who'd adapted to mountain life with surprising grace, who'd learned to tend infants with natural skill, who'd stood beside him against legal threats without flinching. Convincing enough that no judge would question it. Eleanor nodded slowly. "I can do that. For Stella and Daniel." "For both of them," Hank corrected. "We're a package deal now." The next morning, they rode down to town together, the babies bundled securely in a wagon Hank had modified with extra springs and careful padding. Father Murphy was staying at the hotel while ministering to the local mining camps, and he agreed to perform the ceremony that afternoon. "You understand what you're undertaking?" the priest asked privately while Eleanor changed Stella's diaper in the hotel room. "I understand I'm trying to protect 2 children who never asked to be orphaned," Hank replied. "Everything else is details." "Marriage is more than details, son." Hank looked through the window at Eleanor, who was singing softly to Stella while Daniel played with a wooden rattle someone had carved for him. "Father, I've spent 7 years chasing something that probably never existed. Now I have something real, something that needs protecting. If marriage helps me do that, then marriage is what I'll do." The ceremony was brief, witnessed by Doc Henley, the hotel owner, and 3 minors who happened to be in town. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress she'd purchased at the general store. Hank wore his cleanest shirt and the tie he'd kept for formal occasions he'd never expected to encounter. When Father Murphy pronounced them husband and wife, the babies were sleeping peacefully in a laundry basket lined with quilts. It seemed appropriate somehow. This family had been born from unconventional circumstances, and it would grow in its own unique way. The legal challenge arrived exactly 1 week later, delivered by the same marshal who'd escorted Eleanor originally. Blackwood had obtained his court order, signed by a territorial judge in Denver and backed by federal authority. "Says here the children are to be removed immediately and transported to the territorial orphanage pending placement review," the marshal read, his voice apologetic but firm. Eleanor felt her world tilt sideways. On what grounds? Irregular custody transfer, unsuitable living conditions, and questions about the mental stability of the primary guardian. The marshal's eyes flickered to Hank. Sorry, but that's what the papers say. Hank studied the legal documents, noting the official seals and formal language. How long do we have? I'm supposed to take them now. But the marshal glanced around the cabin, taking in the clean, organized space, the well-fed children, the obvious care that had gone into creating a proper home. But I figure I could give you an hour to say goodbye. Professional courtesy. Marshal, Eleanor said quietly, what if I told you we had our own legal documentation? She reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a folder she'd prepared during their trip to town. Marriage certificate, Doc Henley's medical reports, character references from prominent citizens, and financial statements proving Hank's ability to provide for the children. The marshal read through everything twice, his frown deepening. This complicates things. Does it invalidate your orders? Not exactly, but it gives grounds for appeal. Question is, do you want to fight this in court or just hand them over peaceful-like? Eleanor and Hank exchanged glances. They discussed this possibility during every quiet moment of the past week. We fight, they said simultaneously. The marshal nodded slowly. Then you better get yourselves to Denver City fast. You've got maybe 3 days before they send troops to enforce that order. As soon as the marshal rode away, Hank and Eleanor began preparations for travel. Not the desperate flight they'd initially planned, but a strategic move to fight the legal battle on more favorable ground. They packed carefully, everything the babies would need, documents to support their case, enough supplies for an extended stay in Denver. Hank loaded his rifle and ammunition, not because he expected trouble on the trail, but because trouble had a way of finding him lately. The journey to Denver took 4 days, traveling mostly at night to avoid cavalry patrols that might be looking for them. They camped in hidden valleys and abandoned mine shafts, always listening for pursuit that never came. The babies traveled remarkably well, adapting to life on the road with the resilience of children who'd known nothing but change. Daniel seemed to enjoy the motion of the wagon, often falling asleep to the rhythm of wheels over rough ground. Stella was more alert, her bright eyes taking in every new sight with obvious fascination. On the third night, camped beside a creek in a grove of aspens that whispered secrets in the wind, Eleanor made an observation that had been building in her mind since they'd left the cabin. They're not just surviving this, she said, watching both children sleep peacefully despite the unfamiliar surroundings. They're thriving. Hank looked up from cleaning his rifle. Kids are tougher than most folks give them credit for. It's more than that. Eleanor touched Stella's forehead gently. They trust us completely. They sleep peacefully because they know we'll keep them safe. That's what families do. Is that what we are now? A family? Hank considered the question while reassembling his rifle with practiced efficiency. Started as legal convenience. But somewhere along the way, it became real. Real enough to fight for. Denver City sprawled across the prairie like a collection of buildings that couldn't decide what they wanted to be when they grew up. Mining boom had brought money and people, but not much in the way of planning or organization. Streets muddy from recent rain wound between buildings that ranged from elegant hotels to ramshackle saloons, with everything in between. Hank rented rooms at the Windsor Hotel, the finest establishment in the city, using money he'd been saving for another expedition to the Pacific Northwest. If they were going to fight a legal battle, they needed to present themselves as respectable citizens capable of providing proper care. Their attorney was a young man named Samuel Peterson, recently graduated from law school in Boston and eager to make his reputation on challenging cases. He listened to their story with increasing interest, taking careful notes and asking pointed questions about documentation. The marriage certificate helps enormously, he said, reviewing their paperwork. Doc Henley's medical reports are excellent, but we need to address the underlying question of how you acquired custody originally. Through legal gaming, Hank said firmly, which the opposition will argue was inherently inappropriate when children were involved. Peterson leaned back in his chair, thinking, we need to reframe this. Not as a gambling transaction, but as a rescue operation. Eleanor frowned. What do you mean? Santos was neglecting those children, possibly abusing them. You saved them from dangerous circumstances and provided immediate care. The poker game was just the mechanism. The important part is that you acted to protect vulnerable infants. Hank nodded slowly. Can you make that argument stick? With the right witnesses and proper presentation, yes. But we'll need more than just good intentions. We'll need to prove that current arrangements are superior to any alternatives the state might offer. The hearing was scheduled for the following Monday in territorial court, presided over by Judge Harrison Caldwell, a stern man in his 60s who'd built his reputation on strict interpretation of law and minimal tolerance for unconventional arrangements. Peterson spent the weekend preparing their case, interviewing character witnesses who'd traveled from their mountain community to testify on Hank's behalf. The hotel owner who'd extended credit without question. The general store proprietor who'd seen Hank's careful attention to infant nutrition. Father Murphy, who testified to the moral character he'd observed during his visits. Eleanor prepared differently. She studied legal precedents in the hotel's small library, researched territorial statutes regarding child welfare, and wrote a detailed statement about her granddaughter's care that left no doubt about her commitment or competence. Hank's preparation was simpler but perhaps more challenging. He wrote down his story, the whole truth about that night in the saloon, the weeks of learning to care for infants, the growing realization that these children had given his life purpose and meaning he'd never experienced while chasing legends through the wilderness. The courtroom was packed Monday morning. News of the unusual case had spread throughout Denver's social circles, drawing curious spectators eager for entertainment. Blackwood sat at the prosecution table with Mrs. Adelaide Morrison from the Territorial Children's Protective Society, while Peterson arranged his documents with nervous precision. Judge Caldwell called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel. We're here to determine custody arrangements for 2 minor children currently in the care of Mr. and Mrs. Morrison. Counselor Blackwood, present your case. Blackwood rose with theatrical confidence. Your Honor, this case represents a clear violation of territorial law and common decency. These children were acquired through gambling, a transaction that treats human beings as property to be won or lost on the turn of a card. He painted a picture of reckless irresponsibility, using Hank's reputation as a tracker of mythical creatures to suggest mental instability. He questioned the sudden marriage, the isolated living conditions, the complete lack of formal preparation for child-rearing responsibilities. The state has a duty to protect these vulnerable children from well-meaning but ultimately unsuitable guardians, he concluded. Proper institutional care or placement with qualified families is their only hope for normal, productive lives. Peterson's response was methodical and devastating. He called Doc Henley first, who testified about the children's excellent health and development under Hank and Eleanor's care. Father Murphy spoke about the moral character he'd observed, the obvious love and commitment both adults showed toward the children. But the most powerful testimony came from Eleanor herself. Your Honor, she said, standing with quiet dignity, 8 months ago I lost my daughter to violence. I thought I'd lost her children as well. When I found them in Mr. Morrison's care, I expected to find neglect, possibly abuse. Her voice never wavered as she described what she'd actually discovered, 2 babies receiving attentive, loving care from a man who'd sacrificed his own comfort to ensure their well-being. I came to take my granddaughter away, she continued. Instead, I found myself part of something I didn't expect, a real family built on choice rather than circumstance. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Caldwell interrupted, are you saying you support Mr. Morrison's continued custody? I'm saying these children are exactly where they belong, with people who chose to love them when the rest of the world was ready to discard them. When Hank took the stand, he spoke simply about responsibility, about the moment he'd looked at 2 helpless infants and realized that protecting them mattered more than continuing his obsessive quest for a creature that might not exist. Your Honor, I've spent years tracking something I couldn't prove, following evidence that led nowhere. These children are real. Their need is real. My commitment to them is real. Everything else is just paperwork. The judge deliberated for 2 hours while Hank and Eleanor waited in the hotel lobby, the babies sleeping peacefully despite the chaos surrounding their future. Peterson paced nervously, reviewing his notes and muttering about legal precedents. When court reconvened, Judge Caldwell's expression was unreadable. "This case presents unusual circumstances," he began. "The original custody transfer was irregular, the current living arrangements are unconventional, and the legal standing of all parties involved is questionable." Eleanor gripped Hank's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. "However," the judge continued, "the evidence clearly demonstrates that these children are receiving excellent care from people who have demonstrated genuine commitment to their welfare. The court finds no compelling reason to disrupt arrangements that are obviously working well." The courtroom erupted in applause from the mountain folk who traveled to Denver to support them. Blackwood's face went purple with outrage, but his objections were overruled. Custody is awarded to Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, with the requirement that they file quarterly reports with the territorial government regarding the children's welfare and education. Hank felt his knees go weak with relief. Eleanor was crying openly, clutching Stella while Peterson gathered their papers with obvious satisfaction. They returned to the mountains as a legally recognized family, the wagon now carrying not just babies and supplies, but the weight of official approval and community support. The cabin felt different when they arrived, smaller somehow, but more like home than ever before. Eleanor's presence had transformed the space from a bachelor's retreat into something warmer, more complete. Her sewing supplies occupied one corner, baby clothes hung from lines near the stove, and the smell of bread baking had replaced the musty odor of old leather and gunpowder. Summer brought prosperity to their little valley. Hank had given up his searches for the legendary creature entirely, focusing instead on building a life that could support a growing family. He took work guiding hunting parties through the high country, his knowledge of animal behavior and wilderness survival making him popular with wealthy clients from back east. Eleanor proved surprisingly adept at mountain life. She learned to preserve meat, to read weather signs and cloud formations, to shoot accurately enough to protect the children if circumstances required it. Her refined background had included practical skills that translated well to frontier living. The children grew like mountain wildflowers, hardy, bright, and impossible to contain within any conventional boundaries. Daniel took his first steps on a sunny morning in August, tottering between Hank's outstretched arms and the vegetable garden Eleanor had coaxed from rocky soil. Stella followed 3 days later, not to be outdone, charging across the cabin floor with the determination of someone who decided walking was merely the first step toward running. By autumn, both children were talking, real words mixed with elaborate baby language that only they seemed to understand completely. Daniel called Hank Papa with perfect clarity but insisted on calling Eleanor Mama Ellie, like it was all one word. Stella was more economical, Ma and Pa served most purposes, though she could produce no with stunning volume when the situation demanded it. The second winter tested them all. Snow fell early and heavy, sealing them into the cabin for weeks at a time. But instead of feeling trapped, they discovered rhythms of family life they'd never known existed. Eleanor taught both children their letters using charcoal on smooth pieces of bark. Hank carved toys from pine wood, horses, bears, and birds that occupied small hands during the long indoor hours. Evenings were spent by the fire, Eleanor mending clothes while Hank repaired equipment, both children playing at their feet with increasing independence and creativity. Sometimes Hank would tell stories about his tracking expeditions, editing out the failures and frustrations, focusing instead on the beauty of wilderness places and the importance of respecting nature's mysteries. "Did you ever really see Bigfoot, Papa?" Daniel asked one snowy evening, building elaborate structures from wooden blocks. Hank considered the question seriously. "I saw things I couldn't explain. Footprints too large for any known animal. Trees broken in ways that didn't match bear or elk behavior. But seeing and understanding aren't always the same thing. Maybe it was just hiding really well," Stella suggested, practicing her letters on a slate Eleanor had purchased in town. "Maybe," Hank agreed. "Or maybe I was looking so hard for one thing that I missed other things that were more important." Eleanor smiled over her sewing. "Like what?" "Like the fact that the most amazing discoveries sometimes happen when you're not searching for them at all." Spring brought visitors, not legal authorities this time, but friends and neighbors who'd heard about the court victory and wanted to celebrate. The Johansson family from downstream brought fresh bread and news from the outside world. Doc Henley arrived with his annual medical examination and pronounced both children remarkably healthy and well-developed for their age. Most surprising was the arrival of James Fletcher, a newspaper correspondent from the Rocky Mountain News who'd traveled from Denver specifically to write about their story. Human interest piece, he explained, setting up his camera equipment on the cabin's front porch. The public is fascinated by your case, the mysterious tracker who gave up hunting legends to raise orphan children. Not much mystery to it, Hank said, watching Daniel attempt to ride the neighbor's gentle mare while Stella cheered from the fence rail. Just doing what needed doing. But that's exactly what makes it remarkable, Fletcher insisted. In a territory where most people are focused on getting rich quick or getting out alive, you chose to build something lasting. The article that appeared 2 weeks later surprised everyone with its respectful tone and accurate details. Fletcher had captured not just the facts of their unusual beginning, but the genuine love and commitment that had transformed legal convenience into real family bonds. Bigfoot Hunter finds real treasure, read the headline, followed by a story that painted Hank as a man who discovered that some mysteries were worth solving through love rather than relentless pursuit. The publicity brought unexpected consequences. Letters arrived from across the territory, some from people offering support, others from families sharing their own unusual stories of frontier adoption and unconventional family formation. Most surprisingly, several came from scientists and naturalists who'd followed Hank's creature-tracking career and wanted to know if he'd consider returning to field research. Professor Williams from the University of California wants to fund an expedition to study large mammal behavior in the Pacific Northwest, Eleanor read from one particularly official-looking letter. He says your tracking expertise and documentation methods are exactly what they need for legitimate scientific research. Hank took the letter, studying the formal letterhead and generous financial terms. Interested in leaving the children for months at a time? Absolutely not. What if we didn't have to leave them? Eleanor looked up from nursing Stella, who developed a fierce appetite and strong opinions about feeding schedules. What do you mean? Family expedition. They'd pay for everything: travel, equipment, accommodations. You and the children could come along. Make it a real research project instead of a wild goose chase. The idea was intriguing but complicated. The children were still too young for extended wilderness travel, and Eleanor had no experience with the kind of primitive camping that scientific expeditions required. Ask me again in 2 years, she said finally, when they're old enough to walk long distances and sleep anywhere without fussing. Deal, Hank agreed, folding the letter carefully. But I'm keeping the offer open. Might be nice to show them some of the country that shaped their father. Years accumulated like snowfall, each season bringing new challenges and growth. Daniel developed into a serious, thoughtful boy who could track wounded animals through thick forest and calculate mathematical problems in his head with startling accuracy. Stella grew fierce and independent, with her grandmother's quick wit and her father's stubborn determination to solve any problem through persistent effort. They were different as winter and summer, but bound together by shared experience and the security of knowing they'd been chosen, protected, and given opportunities that many frontier children never received. Hank aged into his role as father and community leader like a man finally wearing clothes that fit properly. His shoulders stayed broad and strong from physical labor, but his eyes lost the restless quality that had driven him through years of fruitless searching. He'd found what he was really looking for, even though he hadn't known he was looking for it. Eleanor bloomed in the mountain environment like a plant finding ideal soil conditions. She learned to hunt, to track, to read weather patterns and animal behavior. But she never lost the refinement that made her the civilizing influence their household needed, the one who insisted on proper grammar, taught music and literature, and somehow always knew when someone needed extra attention or comfort. The children understood their origins, naturally. Hank and Eleanor had never concealed the circumstances of their meeting, the poker game that had changed everything, the legal battles that had nearly separated them. But it was simply family history to Daniel and Stella, no more troubling than any other tale of frontier survival. Tell us about the night you won us, Stella would demand, curled between her parents by the fireplace during winter evenings. Tell us about the lawyers, Daniel would add, eyes bright with interest in the dramatic confrontations. And they would tell it, alternating perspectives and adding new details or emphasis depending on their audience and mood. It was their creation story, the moment when scattered individuals had been gathered into something complete and purposeful. The telegram arrived on Daniel's 8th birthday, delivered by a Western Union rider who seemed surprised to find such a prosperous homestead at the end of what appeared to be a game trail. The yellow envelope carried official markings and multiple forwarding stamps. "Wire for Hank Morrison," the rider announced, accepting coffee and a slice of Eleanor's famous apple pie while his horse rested. Hank opened the telegram at the kitchen table while Eleanor supervised the children's birthday celebrations, and the rider regaled them with stories from his delivery route. Daniel read over his father's shoulder, his young face growing serious as he absorbed the formal language. "Washington, D.C. Stop Smithsonian Institution requests consultations. Stop cryptozoology research expeditions. Stop full funding family accommodations. Stop reply urgent stop." Eleanor looked up from cutting cake. "What is it?" "Job offer," Hank said slowly. "From the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. They want me to head up a research expedition studying unknown large mammals in the Pacific Northwest." The delivery rider whistled appreciatively. "Smithsonian, eh? That's big doings, mister." "How big?" Eleanor asked. Hank reread the telegram carefully. "Full funding, family accommodations, scientific credibility instead of newspaper mockery. Everything I wanted 7 years ago." Daniel studied his father's face with the perceptiveness of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions accurately. "But you don't want it now?" "I want to know why they're interested suddenly, after years of ignoring my research." The answer came in a letter that arrived 3 days later, carried by regular mail along with newspapers and supply catalogs. Professor Charles Whitman from the Smithsonian's Natural History Department had written a detailed explanation. Recent expeditions in Alaska Territory had uncovered physical evidence that supported some of Hank's earlier findings: footprint casts, hair samples, even photographs of unusual track patterns. The scientific community was beginning to acknowledge that large, unknown primates might actually exist in North America's remote wilderness areas. "Your documentation methods and field experience make you uniquely qualified to lead this investigation," Whitman had written. "We're prepared to offer a 5-year contract with full academic backing and publication rights for any discoveries." Eleanor read the letter twice, her expression thoughtful. "It's everything you worked for." "It was everything I worked for," Hank corrected. "Now I'm working for something different. The children shouldn't prevent you from fulfilling your calling." Hank looked across the cabin where Daniel was teaching Stella to whittle, both of them concentrating with the focused intensity that suggested this lesson mattered deeply to them both. "My calling changed," he said simply. "These children are my calling now." But Eleanor had been thinking, and over the following weeks she began making suggestions that surprised him. What if they could combine his research interests with their family responsibilities? The children were old enough now to travel, curious enough to benefit from seeing different parts of the country, smart enough to contribute to expedition activities in age-appropriate ways. "Think about what we could teach them," she said one evening while they watched the children play by the creek in the fading light. "Geography, natural science, survival skills, the value of scientific inquiry. You want to spend months camping in primitive conditions with 2 8-year-olds? I want to show them that learning never stops, that their father's work has real value, that families can accomplish extraordinary things when they work together." The discussion continued for weeks, through letters exchanged with Professor Whitman, consultations with Doc Henley about the health implications of extended wilderness travel, and countless conversations with the children about their willingness to participate in such an adventure. Daniel was immediately enthusiastic. "We could help track. I can already follow deer trails, and I know how to measure footprints properly." Stella was more practical. "What about school? Miss Patterson says we're ahead of most children our age, but we'd miss months of formal instruction." "We'd be learning different things," Eleanor explained. "Things you can't study from books." By Christmas, they'd reached a decision. They would accept the Smithsonian contract, but with modifications. The expedition would be family-based, with appropriate accommodations for children. Eleanor would serve as expedition photographer and documentation specialist. The children would participate as junior researchers, learning field techniques while contributing to data collection. Professor Whitman's response was enthusiastic. The Smithsonian had never attempted a family-based research expedition, but the publicity value alone made it worth trying. Scientific Family Explores America's Mysteries would make excellent headlines and potentially inspire public interest in natural history research. Preparations began immediately. Hank designed camping equipment suitable for children, lightweight tents, portable cooking systems, weather protection that could be set up quickly in emergency conditions. Eleanor researched photography techniques and ordered the latest camera equipment from Denver. The children studied maps, learned basic scientific observation methods, and practiced the kind of detailed note-taking that real research required. The expedition departed in late spring, their customized wagon loaded with scientific equipment, camping supplies, and everything needed to maintain a mobile household for months at a time. Thunder and Moses were supplemented by 2 additional horses, carefully chosen for their calm temperaments and reliability under challenging conditions. Their first destination was the Olympic Peninsula in Washington Territory, where recent logging operations had reported unusual animal activity and unexplained phenomena. The journey took 6 weeks, following railroad lines where possible, wilderness trails when necessary. The children adapted to travel life with remarkable ease, treating each new camp as an adventure rather than an inconvenience. Daniel proved exceptionally skilled at reading terrain and spotting wildlife signs. Stella demonstrated an unexpected talent for organizing expedition supplies and maintaining detailed journals of their daily activities. Eleanor discovered she had a natural eye for photography, capturing not just potential evidence but the beauty of landscapes they encountered and the growing confidence of her children as they mastered new skills. Hank found himself working more effectively than he had during his solitary years. Having a team, even a team consisting of his wife and children, meant he could focus on tracking and analysis while others handled camp management and equipment maintenance. Their first significant discovery came in July. In a remote valley where old-growth forest created cathedral-like spaces between massive trees. Daniel spotted the tracks first, footprints larger than any bear, showing a stride length and weight distribution that suggested bipedal locomotion. "Papa, look at this," he called, excitement making his voice crack. Hank examined the prints with growing excitement. Clear impressions in creekside mud, showing 5 distinct toes and what appeared to be an opposable thumb structure. The stride pattern suggested an animal weighing at least 400 pounds, moving with purposeful intelligence rather than random wandering. Eleanor documented everything with her camera while Stella measured and sketched each print with meticulous accuracy. This was exactly the kind of evidence that had eluded Hank during his solitary searches, clear, well-documented, supported by multiple observers. They followed the trail for 3 days, establishing camp each evening and continuing the pursuit each morning with scientific methodology rather than obsessive desperation. The tracks led deeper into wilderness areas where few humans had ever traveled, through terrain that challenged even Hank's considerable woodcraft skills. On the 3rd evening, they found more than footprints. The structure was hidden in a grove of ancient cedars, built from interwoven branches and moss in a pattern that suggested both intelligence and familiarity with forest engineering principles. Not a nest exactly, but a shelter designed by something that understood weather protection and concealment. "It's like a house," Stella whispered, studying the construction with fascination rather than fear. "A very well-designed house," Eleanor added, photographing the structure from multiple angles. Hank examined the building techniques with professional interest. The branch placement showed sophisticated understanding of load distribution and weather resistance. Whoever, or whatever, had built this possessed intelligence far beyond any known animal species. They made camp nearby that night, maintaining careful watch schedules and keeping their fires small to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The children slept peacefully, exhausted by the day's hiking, while Hank and Eleanor took turns monitoring their surroundings for any sign of the structure's builder. Just before dawn, Daniel woke suddenly, sitting upright in his bedroll with the alertness of someone who'd heard something important. "Papa," he whispered urgently. "Something's watching us." Hank was instantly awake, rifle in his hands, scanning the tree line for movement. Eleanor gathered Stella protectively while maintaining absolute silence. Then they saw it. A shadow among shadows, massive and upright, standing motionless at the edge of their firelight's reach. Not threatening but not retreating either. Simply observing them with what seemed like curious intelligence. The encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds, long enough for everyone to see clearly, too brief for detailed observation. Then the figure stepped backward into the forest and disappeared so completely it might have been a shared dream. "Did everyone see that?" Eleanor asked quietly. 4 voices confirmed simultaneously, yes. They broke camp at first light, not from fear but from respect. They'd achieved what Hank had sought for 7 years, definitive proof that unknown primates inhabited North America's remote wilderness. But more importantly, they'd done it together, as a family, creating memories that would bind them forever. The return journey to Colorado took longer, partly because they stopped frequently to document additional evidence, partly because none of them were eager to end this shared adventure. They discovered something more valuable than scientific proof. They'd learned that they could face any challenge successfully when they faced it together. Back in their valley, life resumed its comfortable rhythms, but with new dimensions added. The children had gained confidence that came from successfully completing a difficult expedition. Eleanor had discovered talents she'd never suspected she possessed. Hank had found the scientific recognition he'd sought, but realized it mattered less than the family he'd built. The Smithsonian published their findings the following year, complete with Eleanor's photographs and detailed documentation compiled by the entire family. Evidence for unknown North American primates became required reading in natural history programs across the country. But for the Morrison family, the real treasure wasn't scientific fame or academic recognition. It was the knowledge that they'd started as strangers thrown together by circumstance and had become something unbreakable through choice, commitment, and love that refused to acknowledge any obstacles as permanent. Daniel grew into a naturalist and guide, eventually establishing a school for wilderness education that drew students from across the nation. Stella became a photographer and explorer, documenting the changing West with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd learned during their family expedition. Both married partners who understood that being part of the Morrison family meant accepting adventure as a normal part of life, that love was demonstrated through shared challenges rather than comfortable routine. Hank and Eleanor aged together in the cabin by the creek, surrounded by grandchildren who treated their stories like adventure novels and their wisdom like inherited treasure. They grew old like the mountains themselves, slowly, steadily, weathered smooth by experience but never diminished in strength or purpose. On quiet evenings, they would sit on the expanded porch Hank had built to accommodate a growing family, watching their grandchildren explore the same creek banks and forest trails that had once seemed so lonely and purposeless. "Any regrets?" Eleanor asked one such evening, her hair now silver in the lamplight, her hands still strong from decades of mountain living. Hank considered the question while watching his grandson attempt to skip stones across the creek with the same determined concentration Daniel had shown at that age. About giving up the search? About everything. The poker game, the legal battles, the expedition, all of it. Hank reached over and took her hand, calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Not a single one. Turns out the greatest discovery of my life was right there in that saloon, wrapped in an army blanket, waiting for someone to care enough to take a chance. Even though you never proved what you were originally searching for? Especially because of that. Hank's voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned the difference between what he'd wanted and what he'd actually needed. Some mysteries are more important than others. Some treasures are worth more than gold or fame or scientific recognition. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that never lost their power to inspire wonder, they could hear the sound of children playing, dinner bells calling families home, and the eternal whisper of wind through pine trees that had witnessed the transformation of a broken man into someone whole. It was the sound of a life well lived, a family well loved, and a gamble that had paid dividends beyond any reasonable calculation. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the valley, the railroad that now connected their remote community to the broader world, bringing new settlers, new opportunities, and new challenges for their children and grandchildren to meet with the same courage and determination that had built this family from nothing. But tonight, all was peaceful. The babies Hank had won with desperate hope and a handful of worthless cards were now adults with children of their own, the circle of family expanding like ripples on still water, each generation carrying forward the lessons learned around campfires and kitchen tables in a cabin that had become the center of their universe. And in the gathering darkness, two old people held hands and remembered the night when everything changed, when a failed Bigfoot hunter bet everything he had left and won more than he'd ever dared imagine possible. Some families are built on blood and tradition. Others are forged in courtrooms and wilderness camps, held together by choice rather than chance, by commitment rather than convenience. The best ones, like the Morrisons, are built on love that refuses to surrender, no matter what the world demands of them.